For 7 years, Miriam clutched the last postcard her older brother Erick ever sent, the one from his honeymoon on the Oregon coast. The official report called it a tragic accident, a rogue wave that swept the happy couple out to sea, but the story never felt right. Now, as the local sheriff holds a rusted, barnacle-encrusted box found in the flood debris miles from that beach, a flicker of the hope she thought was long dead ignites within her. The box was sealed, and whatever secrets it held had been protected from the ocean for 7 long years. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how the ocean can keep a secret? We'd love to hear what you think about fate and second chances down in the comments as we get into today's story. The rain that fell on the small town of Port Blossom, Oregon, in the autumn of 1997 wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a relentless assault from the heavens that lasted for 3 solid days. Rivers swelled, their muddy waters cresting their banks and swallowing roads, fields, and the ground floors of homes. It was the kind of historic flood people would talk about for generations, a force of nature that churned up the landscape and dredged up the past. For Miriam Hill, the flood was a nuisance that kept the bookstore she managed closed for a week. She spent her days listening to the radio, tracking the storm's progress, and feeling that familiar, hollow ache in her chest that always seemed to surface with the smell of salt and rain. It had been 7 years since the sea had taken her brother Erick and his new wife Angelica. 7 years of accepting the unacceptable. At 29, Miriam had built a quiet life for herself, a life defined by the absence of the brother who had been her best friend. The postcard he'd sent from his honeymoon was tucked into the frame of her bedside mirror, his familiar scrawl a daily reminder. "The coast is even more beautiful than the pictures, Mim. Angelica and I are having the time of our lives. See you in a week. Love, E." They never made it back. The police found their rental car parked at a scenic overlook near the old lighthouse. A storm had rolled in that night, and the official theory was that they had been walking on the cliffs and were swept away by a rogue wave. There was. It was a neat, tragic story that closed a case file but left a permanent hole in Miriam's heart. The call came on a Tuesday, a week after the floodwaters had begun to recede. It was the county sheriff. "Miss Hill? We have something here you might want to see." A man clearing debris from his property a few miles up the estuary found something unusual. An hour later, Miriam stood in the sterile, coffee-scented office of the sheriff's station, staring at an object that felt like it had been pulled from another time. It was a small, footlocker-style box, made of dark wood and bound with iron straps. But it was the exterior that held her gaze. It was almost entirely covered in a thick, calcified layer of barnacles and sea life. It looked ancient, alien. It smelled of brine and long-forgotten depths. A retired detective, a man named Clifton Bell, stood beside the sheriff. Miriam remembered him. He was the one who had worked Erick's case all those years ago. His face was more lined now, his hair grayer, but his eyes held the same weary kindness. "We wouldn't have bothered you, Miriam," he said, his voice gentle. "But the fellow who found it noticed this." He pointed to a corroded brass plate on the lid, where the name Hill was barely miraculously still legible. "We think it was probably wedged deep inside one of the sea caves south of the lighthouse," the sheriff explained. "The flood must have created a surge powerful enough to break it loose and carry it upriver. It's the only explanation for how it survived this long." Bell cleared his throat. "Look, Miriam, it's probably just an old family keepsake that got lost to the sea decades ago. I wouldn't get your hopes up." But it was too late for that. Hope, fierce and painful, was already clawing its way up her throat. She looked at the sealed, rusted lock. "We have to open it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The sheriff nodded, and a deputy brought in a crowbar. The sound of rusted metal groaning and snapping echoed in the quiet room. With a final crack, the lid broke free. Inside, nestled amongst seaweed and sand, was a thick, oilskin pouch. It was tightly sealed with wax. Miriam held her breath as the sheriff carefully cut it open. He reached inside and pulled out 2 items, a leather-bound journal and a silver canister used for holding photographic film. The journal was swollen and stiff, but the oilskin had protected it from the worst of the water damage. The film canister seemed completely intact. Miriam reached out a trembling hand and touched the cover of the journal. She recognized it instantly. It was a gift she'd given Angelica at her bridal shower. "That's hers," she whispered. "That was Angelica's journal." Clifton Bell put a hand on her shoulder. "All right," he said softly, a new note of interest in his voice. "Let's see what secrets your brother left behind." The initial excitement quickly gave way to the slow, frustrating work of investigation. Detective Bell, though officially retired, couldn't shake his curiosity and agreed to help on an informal basis. The journal was too fragile to be opened without causing it to crumble. "It needs a professional," Bell said, giving her the card of a forensic document specialist in Portland. "It'll be expensive." The film was another problem. Developing a 7-year-old roll that had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean was a long shot. "Most labs won't even touch it," the local photo guy told them. "The emulsion is likely shot." Miriam didn't care. For the first time in 7 years, she had a tangible link to Erick's last days, a thread to pull on. She used a significant portion of her savings, money she had been setting aside for a down payment on a small house, to pay for the services they needed. She sent the journal to the document expert in Portland and, after dozens of calls, found a specialty lab in California willing to attempt to develop the film. Then, they waited. During that week of waiting, Miriam felt like a ghost in her own life. The bookstore, the quiet evenings, the routine she'd built as a fortress against her grief. It all felt thin and meaningless. She found herself driving out to the old lighthouse, the place where Erick and Angelica were last seen. She'd avoided it for years, the sight of it a monument to her loss. Now she stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping her hair, and stared down at the churning gray water. She imagined the small box being tossed in the surf, getting lodged in a dark, hidden cave, waiting patiently for a storm to set it free. Detective Bell would call every other day. "Anything?" she'd ask. "Patience, kid," he'd reply. He was digging back into the old case files, rereading witness statements, looking at the tide charts from that fateful night. "Something never sat right with me about that rogue wave theory," he admitted to her one afternoon over coffee. "The Coast Guard report said the seas were choppy that night, but nothing out of the ordinary for this stretch of coast. Your brother was a strong swimmer. He grew up on this water." The first breakthrough came from the document expert. He called to say he'd managed to salvage sections of the journal. He emailed the transcribed pages to the sheriff's station. Miriam and Bell huddled over the computer screen, reading Angelica's words. The first several pages were exactly what they expected. Beautiful, happy descriptions of their honeymoon. Angelica wrote about the charm of Port Blossom, the taste of the fresh seafood, the joy of waking up next to the man she loved. Miriam had to stop reading for a moment, a wave of grief washing over her. But then, the tone shifted. An entry dated 2 days before they disappeared was different. "We found the most amazing hidden cove today while hiking south of the lighthouse," Angelica wrote. "It felt like we were the only 2 people on Earth. We were about to leave when Erick spotted a boat coming in. It was strange because it was getting dark and they were running without lights. Erick started taking pictures, thinking the silhouette of the boat against the sunset would look incredible." The next entry was shorter, the handwriting more frantic. "It wasn't fishermen. We saw them more clearly from the cliffs. They were unloading wooden crates onto the beach. One of the men had a rifle. We got out of there as fast as we could. Erick is certain they didn't see us, but I'm not so sure. I have a terrible feeling about this." Miriam's blood ran cold. This wasn't an accident. This was something else entirely. "They saw something they weren't supposed to see," Bell muttered, his face grim. The call from the photo lab in California came the next day. "You're not going to believe this," the technician said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "We got images. Most of the roll was standard vacation stuff, but the last few shots, you need to see these." He emailed the scanned photos. Miriam and Bell watched as the images downloaded, one by one. The first dozen were heart-wrenching. Erick and Angelica, laughing on the beach, building a clumsy sandcastle, kissing in front of the lighthouse, a perfect, sun-drenched honeymoon, frozen in time. Then came the last 4 photos. They were grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The first showed a sleek boat anchored in a rocky cove at sunset. The second showed 2 men carrying a crate onto the shore. The third was a blurry shot of one of the men looking up toward the cliffs, his hand raised as if to shield his eyes. The last photo was the clearest. It was a close-up of the man's face. He was younger, with dark hair and a confident smirk. And he was instantly recognizable. It was Felix Hayes. Miriam gasped. Felix Hayes was a local legend. He'd started with a single fishing boat and had built a shipping empire over the past decade. He was a philanthropist, a city council member, the man whose name was on the new wing of the public library. He was untouchable. "No," Miriam whispered. "It can't be." But it was. Bell stared at the screen, his expression hard as granite. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. Smuggling, most likely. Your brother and his wife stumbled onto his operation, and he silenced them. The rogue wave theory was a lie. The accident was a cover-up. Erick and Angelica hadn't been taken by the sea. They had been murdered." The knowledge was a cold, hard weight in Miriam's stomach, replacing grief with a burning need for justice. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the last, barely legible page of Angelica's journal. The document expert had called it a ghost page, the words so faint he had to use ultraviolet light to make them out. It was a single, terrifying paragraph. "He knows we saw him. FH, he found our motel room. He wants the camera. We're meeting him at the lighthouse tonight. He promised he'll let us go if we give him the film and forget everything. We put this box in the sea cave under the point, just in case. Pray for us." Miriam felt the air leave her lungs. This was their last message, a final, desperate act of self-preservation. They had known they were in danger. They had tried to create an insurance policy, a message in a bottle for a future they weren't sure they would live to see. "This is it," Bell said, his voice grim. "This is what happened. He lured them out there, took what he thought was all of the evidence, and then he killed them." But they had a problem. The photos in the journal were a powerful story, but a skilled lawyer could pick them apart. The photos were grainy, the journal entries circumstantial. Felix Hayes was a pillar of the community with an army of attorneys. They needed more than a 7-year-old story from a waterlogged box. They needed to confront the man himself. Bell, using his old badge and a lot of goodwill from the current sheriff, arranged the meeting. The pretense was a donation Hayes was making to the Police Benevolent Fund. Miriam insisted on being there. "I need to see his face when he sees ours," she told Bell. They met in a conference room at the station, the same station where she had first laid eyes on the box. Hayes swept in, all expensive suit and charismatic smile, shaking hands and making small talk. He looked older than in the photo, more polished, but the confident smirk was the same. Bell started casually talking about old, unresolved cases in the county. He mentioned the tragic loss of the Hill Honeymooners in 1990. "A terrible shame," Hayes said, his expression one of perfect sympathy, a reminder of how powerful the ocean can be. Miriam felt a surge of rage, so hot and intense it made her dizzy. She held it in, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Bell then slid a photograph across the table. It was one of the happy ones, of Erick and Angelica smiling on the beach. "We found some of their lost belongings," Bell said, his eyes locked on Hayes. This was among them. Hayes glanced at the photo, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "How wonderful for the family," he said, recovering smoothly, "to have something to remember them by." "We found this too," Bell said, sliding the second photograph across the table. It was the picture of the boat in the cove. Hayes's face remained a polite mask, but Miriam saw a new stillness in his posture, a tightening around his eyes. "Just a fishing boat," he said with a dismissive shrug. Then came the final move. Bell placed the last photograph on the table, the grainy close-up of a younger Felix Hayes looking up from the beach with a rifle slung over his shoulder. The silence in the room was absolute. The mask finally dropped. For a fleeting moment, Miriam saw raw, cold fury in Hayes' eyes, the look of a cornered animal. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, pushing back from the table. "You can't possibly think this blurry old photo's anything. My lawyers will—" "We also have her journal," Miriam said, her voice clear and strong. "Angelica's journal. She wrote about you, Mr. Hayes. She wrote about the meeting at the lighthouse." Hayes froze, his face pale. He stared at Miriam, and in that moment, she knew with certainty that she was looking at the man who had murdered her brother. He lunged, not for the door, but for the evidence on the table, a desperate attempt to destroy the past. But it was too late. The conference room door opened and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Felix Hayes didn't confess immediately. He threatened, he blustered, he called his lawyers. But the evidence was too much to overcome. The journal, the photos, and the discovery of the box created a story that was impossible to deny. Under the pressure of a lengthy interrogation, he finally broke. He told them everything. He admitted his shipping business in those early days was a front for smuggling high-end electronics. Erick and Angelica had accidentally photographed one of his drops. He'd tracked them down to their motel and, seeing how young and scared they were, thought he could intimidate them. He arranged the meeting at the lighthouse, promising to let them go if they handed over the camera. They met on the cliffs during the rising storm. They gave him the camera, pleading for their lives. Hayes said he almost let them go. But as he looked at the camera in his hands, he realized he could never be sure they hadn't told someone, that they hadn't made copies. He couldn't risk it. In the wind and the rain, he pushed them from the edge of the cliff into the violent sea below. He never knew they had hidden a second roll of film in the journal. He never knew that for 7 years, his secret had been waiting, sealed in a box, protected by the very ocean he had used to hide his crime. 3 months later, Miriam stood on those same cliffs by the lighthouse. It was a clear, sunny day. Beside her, Detective Bell stood quietly. They had held a memorial service for Erick and Angelica that morning. Friends and family who had spent 7 years in the ambiguity of an accidental death were finally able to grieve with the certainty of truth. Miriam held a single white rose. She looked out at the calm, blue water, so different from the raging monster in her imagination. The ocean hadn't been the villain in this story. It had been the keeper of a promise, the silent witness that had finally delivered justice for her brother. She had put the bookstore up for sale and was planning to move. The ghosts in Port Blossom were finally at peace, and so was she. Tossing the rose into the air, she watched as it cartwheeled down, landing gently on the surface of the water, a final, beautiful farewell. She had her brother back, not in life, but in memory. His story complete. If you found a clue that could solve a painful mystery from your past, but knew pursuing it would bring up all that pain again, what would you do? Let us know your thoughts below. And if you appreciate stories of truth coming to light, be sure to subscribe for more. We're grateful to have you with us.